I've been trying to get in contact with Sargon for debate for about a week now, but his attitude towards it seems to have dwindled, so I'm making this video clearing up stuff that I didn't talk about and responding to some of Sargon's video of me. By the way, I'm aware this is a very long video, so feel free to switch to any of the topics you wish to see me discuss later on in the video by clicking in the description below. First, this idea that I'm a NEET, or not in education, employment, or training. Well, I was in education last year, so that's done. I'm currently employed, and at the same time, I'm also doing an NVQ, so check, check, and check. There's also this LARPing thing. Oh gee. I think Sargon misinterprets radicals using tongue-in-cheek hyperbole for being actual revolutionaries of the mind. Not that I'm LARPing, no, this is LARPing.
And what we should be doing is pouring 100% of our time into creating professional, anarchist media and distributing it to the World Wide Web, and that's what we're going to do.
And if you're wondering about my voice, yeah, blame that on 8 years of acting. But anyway, let's get into Sargon's critique of the left tactics. Sargon says that some of these radical left people are using bad tactics. Well, fair enough, but this is going to be the inevitable consequence of many people who have had their futures stolen from us by former generations and by the greed of the capitalist markets, which are now basically too fucked up that a collapse is inevitable. As for being middle-class losers, well, firstly we are the working class. If you went by the socialist definition of working class, it is those without the means of production who have to work in order to obtain their needs, hence working class. Capitalist class is those who own the means of production already and use that means of production to exploit others. And no, I don't mean computers or ovens. Capitalism is systemic, we don't have access to what defines our lives. As for leftists living with their parents, yes. Don't know if you've realised, but the housing market is becoming superbly gack. I currently live in a deprived area, and if I hadn't got a job, I'd also be living with my family. This is a really big problem for millennials, and I can only guess it's going to be an even bigger problem for the Zs. And let's actually look into the study, shall we? It records the data from people who were arrested in Berlin. Now, why is Berlin so significant here? Well, wouldn't you know? Berlin is the epicenter of the squatter movement. That's, where the Black Bloc began, and Sargon should know this considering he did a video on the Black Bloc. Squatters are not going to give their addresses, and you know the reason why. In fact, a good chunk of the people in the anarchist movement in England squat. This comes from multiple interactions of people I meet in radical gatherings. A friend of ours recently got evicted from one. Have you ever heard of ANAL? The Autonomous Nation of Anarchist Libertarians. A fantastic penetration of the fabric of society right there. And even if this were all true, what's your point here? Or were you just trying to use that to poison the well? Now we should probably talk about ANTIFA. We might want to do a little quick talk on how ANTIFA began in my country, for example. Well, during the 80s, fascists were growing in size, and the blame was put, obviously, on the scapegoat, immigrants. Fascists were terrorizing Asian immigrants, people like Altab Ali, who was stabbed by skinheads. Fascists were also attacking left-wing folk bands like the Pogues and recruiting young football fans. AFA, Anti-Fascist Action, as it was called back then, rose up to counter these events and demonstrations. And you might think that, peaceful action would have just solved everything back then. But when the Fash marched on Thamesmead in 1991, the resistance against them decided not to confront them. To which the relatively small BNP marchers then continued on to Thamesmead, where they managed to build up a heck of a lot of support. And in the ensuing months, the now far bigger fascist mob attacked counter-protesters in Bermondsey. Fascist action largely decreased as the 90s went on, but they've risen in the past decade for reasons that are far out of our control. That's why it mobilised, a reaction to pathetic attempts that had come before it. It's also worth noting that Antifa is one small part of the whole damn thing. It's one tactic, which is why most of the time you won't see anarchists on the street. You'll see anarchists organising in direct action against prisons. You'll see them direct action against gentrifying buildings, immigration centres. They'll also be building community centres for the poor, and above all, they'll be organising workers to take power back from their bosses. You deride us for using bad tactics, yet when people actually use tactics that you might prefer, like going on strikes, people still deride us. Swaves and swaves of majority of people were against the unions on their strikes in the winter of discontent. So, what do? We can't do this, we can't do that, you're fucked either way. Catch-22. Now let's talk about cops. Now, Sargon's constant piece of gotcha evidence that apparently supports his piece is that when the police go away, rioting ensues. Oh, so the Parisians see the soldiers taking down the cannons from Montmartre, and even though there are basically proto-cops in the area, Paris still manages to bring about a working-class society for about 2 months. You neglect the conditions for why these things happen. We live in a world of basically rampant consumerism, and very few people are engaged in radical groups. And so, much of the time, they latch onto whatever they know. And for many people, that's looting. These are the inevitable consequences of the societies we live in. And yes, individual coppers, we can happily have a conversation with police officers about why their job is oppressive. But this doesn't mean, however, that we support them. That doesn't mean that we care if they're injured in the line of duty whilst they crush dissent. In the same way you probably wouldn't feel much pity if you heard the schoolyard bully got what was coming to him. Now let's take another trip down memory lane in the history of, say, American policing. Police came about due to the industrialization periods in the States and the ever-increasing need for industrial labour in cities and mines. But it was a hassle because of the militancy of it. This would often create martyrs. Rather, police were hired by the capitalist class and trained to use more non-lethal but still suppressive measures to enforce order and break up crowds. When they're not hassling the workers, they were put to the streets to ensure surveillance and dominance. Fear became the new violence. This worked because day-to-day policing allows poor citizens to become accustomed to them, form relations with them. But this also allows hierarchy to wheedle out the police officers more efficient at violent tasks, and lets the elites identify the lead dissidents in the country. The crucial factor is that cops are remained separate entities from the public. Strict disciplines were pushed on police to arrest people for minor things like vagrancy and misconduct, to reinforce police the job that they had to do. And as time went on, police became more and more popular amongst the business classes, and they gave them plenty of dough. And before long, this transformed into the police system we know today. I mean, look at these cops beating French rioters and even protesters because they oppose a Labour bill that was to come into effect. Or what about something closer to home from non-violent protesters? Here are some capitalists who are gentrifying London. They are a bunch of property owners. They are effectively dictating how common people will live. Now, here are the protesters outside. Notice who the cops are defending here. Not the powerless people who need a place to live. Why does someone have to believe that they are crushing dissent amongst the working class in order for it to be so? Just show me one example of an army officer who thinks his job is to defend British corporate interests. Or show me one military serviceman who believes his job in the Middle East is for oil. Yeah, you probably can't find any. Now here comes his point about me blaming capitalists is okay, but fascists blaming, immigrants and communists is very, very bad. Yes. And this is the distinctive difference between communists and fascists. The far left's enemies are the capitalists, who possess the land, those who directly or indirectly cause the suffering and misery of billions of people. The far right, let's just say Trump for this matter, okay? I'm not saying he's far right by any means, okay? He blames Mexicans. He blames immigrants, despite the fact that the reason for the massive influx of immigrants from Mexico is due to America's overproduction of corn through subsidies, which resulted in Mexican trade going out of business. And there's also this thing called the war on drugs. This also happens because in places like Haiti, charities send bulk amounts of their stock to developing countries. Sounds great, right? Well, yes, but the industry there has crashed because charity clothing is far, far cheaper. By the way, the communists knew who the bad guys were back in Weimar Germany. The government, the businessmen. Only when Hitler came along and started blaming the Jews did businessmen start backing him and giving him a presence. This is the reason why fascism has historically been considered a revolution of the bourgeoisie. Because when their system starts crumbling and people stop believing the lies of the liberal establishment, they do anything to protect it. Even if that means ethnic cleansing. And now we get to this bit about George Soros, and it's worth noting that I never actually said that George Soros funds domestic terror, despite how Sargon used Thunderfoot-style editing to pull this off. I said it was more probable that Soros was funding these groups as a way to de-radicalize them, like, numerous people did at Occupy Wall Street. Soros, funnily enough, also funded Occupy Wall Street. The Koch brothers fund Americans for Prosperity, an organisation that uses conspiracy and destroying jobs cliches to attack the Green Movement. This is what wealthy capitalists do. Also all these, Craigslist posts. I think if you spent $70,000 on, 200 protesters, you'd be called a bad business person. Also, management likes to cut expenditures, meaning they're in the business of organising protesters to do it for free rather than to pay them. And rioters are going to riot. It happens. There doesn't need to be a conspiracy. Social studies. People who do social studies are just stupid, right? Just to let you know, I never did a social studies degree or anything to that effect. And yes, Comrade Sargon of the working class, blaming people for being coaxed into fulfilling their dreams that barely any will accomplish under capitalism. Constant media education telling us every day, chase your dreams, you can be the best, all you have to do is try your hardest. Well, people followed their dreams, they took risks, and only do they find out later that the system won't be able to support 90% of the population becoming superstars. It's not my fault that the course I may have attended wasn't what I thought it was going to be like, and it wasn't my fault that I didn't connect well with the people at the uni or where I lived. Maybe you shouldn't blame people for the misled actions of their youth. And anyway, what kind of individualism is this? Seriously, look at his quote and tell me, is this really individualistic?
You are the ones who chose to do social studies and who chose to do gender studies and sociology as your fucking careers. Don't blame me when you can't get a fucking job.
Only get jobs that people are willing to pay lots of money for. Ignore what you love or what inspires you. Go and work however many hours it takes to fulfill your housing requirements. Never question this. Just do whatever the market decides you have to do. And if you happen to get famous and make, 3.5k a month doing rants at the camera, then, well, so be it. But if you can't make the money, then I don't care. You weren't marketable. Now, I've been met by several commenters detailing that because I have a big computer, I am therefore not a working class person. Well, we've already established the parameters I'm working with here, but there's more so to this. We live in a world where people judge status based on the amount of cool stuff they have access to. A computer, a TV, a camera. These things, however, neglect a larger point. Sure, I can afford these gadgets that I've built up over maybe 4 or 5 years by now, yet altogether they wouldn't even equal a year's rent, probably not even 8. A car is a far more expensive product than a computer, yet if I had one, people probably wouldn't be questioning my middle classness. And it begs a grander point, my generation cannot afford houses. Increasingly we're being pushed into more and more precarious work, and most of us are barely making above minimum wage. It's easy to chastise kids with their cool gadgets and fancy clothes. I'd trade that all in just to have the ability to afford a house and get a stable job as easily as my parents were able to in this system. Both of them were able to get a 2-bed house with a large garden and raise 3 kids with only one main breadwinner back in the early 80s. These things are minuscule in comparison to the fact that we are finding it harder and harder to make a life for ourselves. Relatively minor price tech is not a statement of affluence. If so, benefits recipients with widescreen TVs would have no argument. I should probably say by now this video's thumbnail was made by Jen from Sean and Jen. She's a very, very good artist, and you should check her out if you haven't already, and check out Sean and Jen the channel if you haven't. And if you haven't, then where the hell have you been? Right, so on with the rest of the video. And now we get on to the big one. Boy, I have been labelled a terrorist sympathiser as of late. Sargon, when it comes to terrorism, what do you think capitalism is? It's anti-democratic, it's authoritarian, it was created initially by force. Now, that sounds like your idea of terrorism to me. If there was a group in Nazi Germany that was opposed to their system by using violence, they'd be classified as terrorists as well. Governments define terrorist groups by whoever possesses a threat to their establishment. Of course we should declare some kind of war, but the government does have these things called drones in many increasing numbers. I mean, do you really think we're this stupid to fight a war right now just simply for the sake of consistency? I'd far rather be inconsistent and get somewhere than completely consistent and never take a goddamn step forward. This is George Washington. He disagreed with a 3% tea tax and prevention of settlement beyond Appalachia, and along with the other founding fathers, led the organised militias to revolt against the British and founded what would later become the biggest terror state on the planet. But of course, you probably have more sympathies for this because they're declaring civil war. Except the American Revolution began 10 years before the shot heard around the world happened, and there was plenty of rioting and violence that occurred prior to that. And, would you believe that the revolutionaries didn't coerce on-the-fence people to fight? Didn't take over their property? Didn't destroy their towns in battle? Because only a third of the colonists actually fought in the Americas. A third were loyalists. The other third were just minding their own business. But you'd probably agree with their revolution to some extent because, I don't know, perhaps they fought for the values that you support. Representation. Liberal democracy. This is Joanna Palani. She's an Iranian Kurd YPG fighter in Rojava and has killed over 100 ISIS troops, with $1 million on her head. She is considered a terrorist in her home country and now faces prison charges. No, of course, only actual states can send off troops to kill ISIS. If they get there as part of a left-wing paramilitary, of which the region of Rojava is probably one of the most progressive societies in the Middle East, if not the world, stuff like direct democracy, secularism, communalism, women's rights, etc., well, then you're a terrorist. Fact is, yes, some groups, I'm going to say this, some groups have a better case for their violence than others, okay? Just a small point to Sargon's viewers, I've heard some of them say that the Revolutionary War was justified because it was in self-defense, as the British soldiers were killing unarmed protesters. Very well. Then let's talk about stuff like the Kent State Massacre, where 4 students were killed for peacefully protesting. What about the bombing of Move? Do you think the Black Panthers were bad at their particular situation in society? Ever heard of Blair Mountain? What about the Ludlow Massacre? What about the Haymarket Affair? I mean, why not just throw the entirety of the American labour movement? But I digress, I'm getting ahead of myself, as we'll discuss this later. In short, things that happen in other countries or far in the past are often considered tragedies or horrific events. Yet when those same things happen here and today, then it was just a simple misunderstanding or something that we find outrageous justifications for. Moving on, Sargon thinks that now, because of what I've said, it's justifiable for him to come and break my stuff. Sargon is aware of the difference between private property and personal property. He surely understands our view on bosses, but I guess not. If you're employing someone and making a profit, you're exploiting the workers. Okay? This is how much someone produces per hour. This is how much profit is made from those products. This is how much someone makes an hour. Where has all the money gone? Did the employee decide how much he was going to get? Or did the employer say, "Hey dude, who needs a job but wastes his education through little fault of his own? This is how much you're worth. Work for me, or you will eventually starve." It's the latter, isn't it? As David Gray put it, every $15 million home made to be bought by some Russian oligarch is $15 million worth of labour that could have been spent on hospitals, roads, council housing. But of course, this is our society we live in is structured, and of course, we have no choice but to obey the law of the market. And you call yourself a radical. Wink, wink. Speaking about private property, here's a little history on the right of private property for Sargon. Violence. No, I'm sorry, but this video is taking way too long, which is why I highly suggest these videos that give people a better understanding of where private property as we know it originated from. They're pretty good, and I suggest you definitely go watch them. Now we get to the point about real-life problems, and apparently anarchists, communists, whatever, don't actually care about the real-life problems of the poor, and that we're too utopian, and that we're just middle-class hippies and whatnot. Okay, believe me, there was a very strong socialist working class presence back in the day. Like property owners using poor Irishmen as people to go down to the mines because they were cheaper than slaves. They'd arrive out of those mines, bleeding all over. In fact, it got so bad that when little girls went down to do the capitalist bidding, they'd sometimes think they were dying when they had their first periods. This created a radicalized working class in America and the rise of unions like the IWW, which amassed 150,000 members at its highest. Now, what happened to them? The establishment interfered, broke the union, other union members were shot and killed, many were arrested. Joe Hill got executed on circumstantial evidence of killing a police officer despite massive evidence to the contrary. Big Bill had to flee to the Soviet Union to escape the harassment. When John Reed wanted to help increase the strength of the Communist Party, he was arrested for conspiracy. Well, no, that would have happened, but he was in Russia at the time, where he died because the US embargo on the Soviet Union had made huge shortages in medicine there. Yeah, so it looks like it was pretty damn scary back then, and the state and the capitalists did everything they could to repress the workers' movement. Good thing they learned about that after the war and granted them a few reforms, eh? Now add 100 years of exponential consumerism back with tons of propaganda about socialism because the USSR is a really good scapegoat right now. The neoliberal reforms of the 80s, the destroying of unions in our countries, outsourcing of jobs, but oh wait, wasn't it the unions who were responsible for this? No, maybe it was not wanting to give the workers here such a good time, so they exploited another country. And now, who are the ones that the Conservatives blame? Immigrants. Again, they're a symptom. Now we get to liberals. And just the way he presented this just sounded like Fox News, alright? Yes, our statement has been against liberals. It has been against centrism, because quite like what Martin Luther King said, the greatest threat to the black people's struggle is not the radicals, but the overwhelming amount of moderates who chastise and tease people and tell us to calm down. I think, however, if I genuinely hate liberals, I probably wouldn't have many friends right now, would I? Okay, many of my best friends are liberals, moderates, centrists, whatever you want to call them. Most of us came from there. And those who have gotten past our puritanical early days as rad leftists have understood this, and we're trying to reach out. We're trying to be less sectarian. It is difficult, however, due to the manufacturing of consent from the media making our political spectrum incredibly minute to uncomfortable opinions. The debate is not as simple as, if you're a liberal, we hate you. For all the venting you see, it is, as I discussed, a form of frustration that inevitably comes out of a population that largely chastises radical opinion. There are some liberals that will irk us more than others, like Cenk Uygur, who doesn't even seem to acknowledge that there even is a radical left, who resort to conspiracy and false flag whenever there's a left-wing attack. Oh no, but he's only accusing them. But it's quite like Alex Jones. In fact, he practically is the liberal Alex Jones right now. And finally, we'll get to the point about why apparently it's okay if left-wing people attack people that they just disagree with. Well, it's not people that we just disagree with, okay, it's Nazis. We've made analyses of this for like decades, hundreds of years, analysing who the enemy are and what we should do to attack them, okay? Yes, Sargon, you get to decide what goes where if your analysis stands up. What is responsible for the exploitation of workers? Capitalism. Who are the people who exploit them? Politicians, bosses, landlords, so on. Who is responsible for defending them? The police. Who collaborates the working class together with the capitalists? Fascists. Who is responsible for the prison-industrial complex? Who is responsible for more people behind bars than Stalin? Who is responsible for the war on drugs? Who is responsible for killing workers who try and stand up and organise their workplace? Who is responsible for 65 people having more wealth than 3.7 billion? Who is responsible for the catastrophic destruction of natural resources to the point where now society faces almost inevitable collapse? Now, you call yourself a radical, probably tongue-in-cheek, but nonetheless, even if we did get to your Rousseau, Lockean wet dream of a liberal society, which, believe me, will never happen because the elites are not in the interest of reforming to antebellum, all you'd be doing is just rolling back the clock and we'd start the process all over again. Now, why is this? Because the society you operate under reacts to the conditions it's in. And when you give people the right to accumulate property, people will eventually have it in the hands of a few because of the structure of capitalist markets. And when that happens, it creates frustration with the dispossessed. And when that happens, you're going to have to find people to defend your property. And when that happens, it causes them to fight back. You can bury my points under propaganda and you can use force to suppress them if you want. But what we've learned from the United States to Russia to France is that reform only works for so long and eventually chickens come to roost. Do not go and defend capitalism when you live off the back of the poorest of the poor who make your life easier.
Your future is to be eternally on the bottom of society, wasting your energy trying to overthrow everything to create a system that benefits a few at the expense of the many. How the fuck you can think that's a solid solution or plan for any society is beyond me.
I don't know, Sargon, but you sure do.